Number 8. Pontiac Chieftain. The Pontiac Chieftain in 1955 arrived with a new engine, the Stratostreak V8, that replaced the straight 8 that Pontiac had been building since 1933, ending a 22-year run of the inline configuration in favor of an overhead valve V8 that produced 180 horsepower in standard trim and that transformed the full-size Pontiac's performance character in a single monoyear. The Chieftain's new body, shared with the 1955 Chevrolet, gave it the wraparound windshield, the lower roofline, and the two-tone paint combinations that 1955's American automotive aesthetic had established as the correct visual language for the decade. Its silver streak hood chrome strips, the Pontiac styling signature that had identified the division since 1935, ran down the hood of a car that was, in mechanical terms, a completely different vehicle from the one it replaced. Its 316 cubic inch Stratostreak V8 and its Hydra-matic automatic gave the Pontiac buyer in 1955 the full-size American car with a genuine V8 performance argument for the first time in the division's history as a volume seller. The Chieftain is at number 8 because in 1955, the car that opened this list did so as the entry point into a year when every American manufacturer was introducing or improving its V8, and because the Pontiac that arrived with a new engine in 1955 arrived as a different car than the one that left with the old one in 1954. Number 7. Oldsmobile 88. The Oldsmobile 88 in 1955 was the descendant of the car that had, in 1951, inspired Ike Turner and Jackie Brenston to record Rocket 88, a song that many music historians have identified as the first rock and roll record, named for the Oldsmobile's overhead valve V8 designation that the American car buyer associated with performance in the years before the Chevrolet 265 made V8 performance accessible at the Chevrolet price point. The 1955 Oldsmobile 88's 324 cubic inch Rocket V8 produced 185 horsepower in standard configuration, more than the new Chevrolet 265, more than the Pontiac Stratostreak, and in a full-size body that communicated the Oldsmobile step up from Pontiac in the General Motors hierarchy. Its two-tone paint options, its panoramic windshield, and the Hydra-matic automatic transmission gave the 88 buyer the full-size Oldsmobile with the V8 performance that the nameplate had been making a documented argument for since the late 1940s. The Oldsmobile 88 is at number 7 because in 1955, the car whose engine had inspired what some historians call the first rock and roll record was still the performance Oldsmobile buyers chose when they wanted the Oldsmobile price point and the Oldsmobile V8. And because the Rocket 88 of 1955 was selling to American buyers who associated the name with performance 4 years before Elvis Presley made the decade's musical identity impossible to avoid at any American radio station.
Number 6. Buick Century. The Buick Century in 1955 carried the largest engine in General Motors' lineup, the 322 cubic inch Nailhead V8, producing 236 horsepower, in the lightest body that Buick offered, the shorter special wheelbase rather than the longer Super or Roadmaster platform. The result was what Buick had been calling the banker's hot rod since the Century's introduction, a car that looked like the full-size Buick that conservative American professionals drove to conservative American offices, but that accelerated like something those professionals' children might have preferred. The Century could reach 60 miles per hour from a standing start in under 11 seconds in 1955, faster than most American cars that year, in a body that communicated nothing about that capability to the neighbor watching from across the driveway. Its Dynaflow automatic, its two-tone paint, and its standard power accessories gave the Century buyer the full Buick luxury experience with the performance the Nailhead V8 produced without advertising it. The Century is at number 6 because in 1955, the car that combined the largest GM engine with the lightest Buick body was selling the performance argument wrapped in conservative American luxury, and because the banker's hot rod was one of the fastest production cars available to the American buyer who had decided the fastest car in their price range should not look like it. Number 5. Ford Customline. The Ford Customline in 1955 was the mid-range Ford, above the mainline, below the Fairlane, that the American family of practical means chose when they had decided on Ford, and decided that the mainline's base trim was insufficient and the Fairlane's premium was unnecessary. It was, in the specific commercial sense that defines the middle of any manufacturer's lineup, the car that most Americans could describe as a Ford without specifying further. Its 272 cubic inch Y-block engine, Ford's overhead valve engine introduced in 1954 and refined for 1955, or the thrifty 223 cubic inch inline-six that conservative families still chose for its fuel economy, gave the Customline the performance or efficiency that every American manufacturer was now offering as the decade's standard proposition at a Ford price from the Ford dealer nearest the buyer's address. The Customline is at number 5 because in 1955, the mid-range Ford that the American family chose between the base and the premium models was the car that most of the 7.1 million new automobiles sold that year most closely resembled in its practical commercial logic. And because the car that nobody photographed at the time, that no automotive journalist wrote a memorable paragraph about, and that no film director chose for the scene that required something to say something about its driver, was, in 1955, the car that most American families actually drove home from the Ford dealer and parked in the garage that June.
Number 4. Chevrolet 210. The Chevrolet 210 was the best-selling passenger car model in the United States in 1955, 831,971 units, more than the Bel Air's 800,968, more than any other single model designation offered by any American manufacturer that year. The 210 sat between the base 150 and the premium Bel Air in the Chevrolet lineup, offering most of the same options, including the new 265 cubic inch V8 that was transforming what a Chevrolet could be, at a price $100 to $200 below the Bel Air's premium trim level. In 1955, the buyer who wanted the 265 without the chrome and script badges of the Bel Air existed in sufficient numbers to make the 210 the most commercially successful single-car model in the United States, outselling the car that every automotive journalist and photographer had decided was the interesting one. Its 265 cubic inch V8, available with the 3-speed manual or the PowerGlide automatic transmission, gave the 210 buyer the mechanically identical engine the Bel Air was receiving magazine coverage for, at a price that reflected the difference in chrome and trim rather than the difference in capability. The Chevrolet 210 is at number 4 because in 1955, the most purchased passenger car in America was not the glamorous Bel Air every automotive writer was photographing. It was the 210, chosen by 831,971 Americans who confirmed that an extra $100 of script badges did not change what happened when they pressed the accelerator. Number 3. Ford Thunderbird. The Ford Thunderbird sold 16,155 copies in its first model year, nowhere near the top of any American sales chart. It is at number 3 because this list is not entirely rational, and neither was the Thunderbird. Ford had looked at the Corvette, introduced in 1953 with only a 6-cylinder engine and struggling commercially, and decided the American 2-seat market needed a genuine V8, a removable hardtop for winter, roll-up windows, and a price the buyer could actually reach. The result came with a dashboard-mounted tachometer, a distinctive dogleg wraparound windshield, optional fender skirts on the rear quarters that gave it the low, floating silhouette, and a spare tire tucked into the trunk rather than mounted externally. Its 292 cubic inch Y-block V8 and its 2-seat configuration gave the Thunderbird a commercial position outside the normal hierarchy of American automotive purchasing. The Thunderbird is at number 3 because in 1955, 16,155 Americans purchased a 2-seat Ford with a V8 and a removable hardtop in the most successful year for American car sales in history.
and because what they purchased is worth more in 2026 than most of the cars that outsold it by a factor of 50. Ford sold 16,155 of them. The automotive press could not stop writing about it. The subsequent 70 years of collector auctions confirmed that the press had correctly identified which car in 1955 was going to matter the longest.
Number 2. Ford Fairlane. The Ford Fairlane debuted in 1955 as the premium full-size Ford, named for Henry Ford's Dearborn estate, positioned above the Customline in the main line and giving the Ford buyer who had decided on the top of the Ford lineup the two-tone paint, the chrome trim, and the interior that the Chevrolet Bel Air buyer was simultaneously choosing from the dealer across the street. Ford and Chevrolet each sold approximately 1.7 million cars in 1955, running neck and neck in the most intense single-year sales war the two companies had ever fought, a competition so close that each manufacturer was adjusting assembly line schedules in response to the other's weekly production figures. Its 272 cubic inch Y-block V8 and its Crown Victoria variant with the distinctive chrome band across the roofline that the buyer who chose it over the standard Fairlane considered worth the additional cost, gave the Fairlane buyer the premium Ford proposition in the year that Ford and Chevrolet were competing for every American buyer who had decided on a full-size American car and had not yet decided which dealer's parking lot to pull into. The Fairlane is at number 2 because in 1955, the premium full-size Ford was selling to hundreds of thousands of Americans who had chosen Ford over Chevrolet for reasons that ultimately reduced to the same variable that always resolves such competitions, which one the buyer's father had driven. Number 1. Chevrolet Bel Air. The Chevrolet Bel Air in 1955 introduced the 265 cubic inch V8, the first V8 Chevrolet had offered since 1917, producing 162 horsepower in base configuration and 180 with the optional power pack, in a body that automotive designer Claire McKitchen had styled with the panoramic wraparound windshield, the two-tone paint options, and the chrome trim that every subsequent description of the 1950s American automobile has used as its visual reference. It sold 800,968 copies. It introduced the small block V8 architecture that Chevrolet would develop into the 263, the 327, the 350, and every subsequent iteration for the next 5 decades. It started just over $2,000 in V8 sedan configuration, and it did all of this in the same calendar year that rock and roll arrived, Disneyland opened, and James Dean died. The Bel Air is at number 1 because in 1955, Chevrolet built the car that defined what a 1955 automobile looked like in the American cultural memory, the two-tone paint, the chrome, the V8 that changed what a Chevrolet was, and because the 265 cubic inch engine that Chevrolet introduced in the 1955 Bel Air is the foundation of the American small block V8 tradition that every enthusiast who has turned a wrench on an American car in the 70 years since has encountered in some form. You do not need to have been alive in 1955 to have driven a descendant of the engine that the 1955 Bel Air introduced.